This week, let's get grimy and weather this awesome 3D printed Panzer Russ. So before we add damage and the elements to this guy, we've got to base coat the primary colours. So this calls for a time lapse. Phew! Now it's finally base coated, we can start working on some chipping. Chips occur from battle damage, general wear and tear, and from weather, so there's no uniform way to create them. I like to use a little piece of sponge as it helps make a random pattern across the armour. I start by taking a dark colour, in this case pure black, and dipping my sponge into it, taking off most of the paint on a piece of tissue until there's only a tad left. Then, using varying levels of pressure, but never too hard, I gently stab the sponge down across all the raised and flat details of the armour. The reason I started with black as the first colour here is to help give a 3D effect and some variation once I add a lighter colour on top. Once I've covered a good chunk of the armour, I switched to a lighter grey to complement the base colour and do exactly the same thing again. I use the black layer as a rough guide, but there's no wrong answer here, just have fun. When the chipping is complete, I break out one of my favourite tools, the trusty burnt umber oil paint. I mix this into a wash with some mineral spirits, water won't work on oil-based paints, and I apply this liberally into the recesses. It will naturally run into the crevices, but I wouldn't worry about any overspill as it's just more variation on the armour. Oil paints are super satisfying to work with, they just splat into the recesses so nicely, but they have a long drying time, sometimes up to 24 hours to fully cure, and you need mineral spirits to clean your brush after. After our burnt umber has been applied all over the tarps, boxes and armour, I got out a shiny new oil paint, Abteilung 502's engine grease. This branding is on point for this tank and I love it. Mixing this up, I use this darker paint more sparingly, around the tracks and where a build-up of grease or the deepest recesses would be. I let the oils dry for an hour or so. They were definitely not completely dry, but I could continue to work around them for now. I've got this Vallejo dry earth texture paste, which is great for old dirt. Using a crusty old brush, I applied this all over the tracks and around the downward facing hull. Dirt is very rarely just one colour, so this is a great starter for dry mud and is a great foundation for some wet mud after. My friend Billy Bob convinced me to try this AK Rough Earth texture, which is just a tub of paste that you mix with paint to create a cool textured paint. Pound for pound, both weight and the British currency in this case, it's cheaper than Games Workshop stuff, but you do have to mix it yourself. I mixed in some Rhinox hide brown paint and created a nice wet mud base. I put this all over the same areas as the previous layer of dry earth, making sure to leave a bunch of dry mud showing. I heavily focused this around the back of the tank, as that's where all the clods of mud would be thrown up here as the tanks grind over terrain. I also added a drop of wet mud above the little access ladder at the back, and near the hatch on the turret to show where troopers are climbing up to speak to the commander, or the tankers have been getting in and out in wet conditions recently. I let the mud texture dry for another hour, and it actually dried really fast. So now it's time for some super easy, but also super satisfying effects with enamel paints. Starting with AK dust effects, I applied this higher up on the tank, in the recesses where dust from dry earth would gather and get stuck to grease, or just settle naturally. This stuff is so easy to apply. It wants to run into the recesses and it dries really quickly. It can also be reactivated with mineral spirits after drying if you want to blend it or mess with it some more. This still needs mineral spirit to clean your brush after. Once the tank was good and dusty, I also grabbed some AK rust effects. All the rest of the paints are AK, and I applied this sparingly to the extra tracks and the exhausts, areas that aren't touched all that often and don't see much wear and tear. The multi-melters and the stubber were kept clean, as the crews would be ensuring these are regularly polished and oiled. It's an active fighting vehicle, it's not derelict, it's just dirty. Then I used some streaking grime specifically designed for Panzer Grey, which is the base coat paint of this tank. I splodged this on healthily, knowing I could take a dry brush later and blend it into the armour, which I then did. After the grime was down, I got out some earth effects, and with a toothpick and a heavily laden brush, I spattered the lower hull from below, showing where water and wet mud has hit the tank. I again focused this more towards the back where the tracks would churn up the ground. This was a really fun step and I highly recommend it. Then I used a little more oil paint that was still good to go on the palette to darken down some of the boxes in the stowage. The last step, and this is a bit of a longer one to do, is to take a brighter metal colour and highlight the edges of the tank. I used Vallejo metal colour silver, again at the insistence of Billy Bob, and it was a dream to use. Already so thin and so easy to apply. I edge highlighted the armour panels and it made the tank look heavy. A longer step, but totally worth it. And there we go, that's how I weather tanks. It's fun, it's fast, and they look awesome when they're done. It's still utterly mad to me that this was liquid a few days ago. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you to all my wonderful channel members and subscribers, you guys are legends.